thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ariel Vaughn with MSBCoach, and today we are talking about executive presence, and I'm really excited because we have two of our coaches here, and the president and CEO of our company, Michelle Braden, and our other coach, April Auger-Perrin. So I would like you guys to just introduce yourselves first before we really dive into our conversation.
Thank you, Ariel. As she said, I'm April Auger-Perrin. I'm one of the coaches here at MSB, focused particularly with millennials, along with Ariel, and happy to have this discussion today about executive presence.
Yeah. And my name is Michelle Braden, and I am also a coach here and the president, and so happy to be here with these two awesome women to talk about this subject, which is near and dear to my heart for many different reasons. So I'm excited about the conversation.
Great. Well, how about we start off the conversation with what is executive presence? You know, it's kind of like they say, you know, I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I know it when I see it. So how would you guys try to define it?
That's right. It is. There's a lot of ambiguity around the term executive presence. And as you said, I think we can all point to it and we can all see it and recognize it in people, although it can be tough to pin down, but that's what we hope to do today, is to pin down some of those characteristics and how we would define executive presence. I think for me personally, executive presence it's all encompassing. So it's beyond what we wear. Obviously that is a piece of it. It's your nonverbal cues, it's your communication, it's online communication, it's how you interact with others, how well you listen. So I would say it's the whole person and it's all encompassing. What about you?
I think that is a good way to say it. It is the package, and we do know it when we see it because we feel it. And so, thinking of a definition of it, I almost would suggest we don't even have to have the word executive in there when we just talk about someone's presence. It was funny, I was asking my husband last night, I said, when you think of the word presence, how would you define it? Because there are some executives who have strong presence, and there are some people who have any sort of positional power, that just they carry a presence about them where you feel comfortable and confident in their space, and we feel it very quickly. It's usually, psychologists tell us it's within 7 to 30 seconds that we just know. We feel that connection, that sense of trust, that sense of you're in my corner. I want to work with you. I want to do things with you. You can see it happen non-verbally. You can just sit back at a restaurant or in the airport and watch people, and you can see it happening. Yeah.
Well, and to add on to that, there's something that is known as snap judgments, and it's what we do instinctively, and that as soon as we meet someone, as Michelle said, we're basically sizing them up within a few seconds of meeting them. And so what we're trying to do, and is it unfair at times? Yes, but it's instinctual in us, where our brain is essentially snapping a picture of this person and saying, can I trust this person? Can I build rapport with this person? And so I think Michelle brings a good point, that it goes beyond the executive level and just presence. So even if you're not in an executive position, but one day you aspire to be, you can work on this idea of presence right now where you are.
Right. Definitely. That's a really good point, and I definitely agree with both of you all. I feel like executive presence, or just presence in general, really is describing your whole package, like how you look and how you speak and your body language, like every little move that you do, has an effect on how people think of you. So let's kind of dive a little bit deeper and talk about what's the importance of executive presence? Why are we talking about it today?
Good question. Before we jump to that, Ariel, I wanted to share something that really could be a whole nother topic of conversation for us, and that is about that snap judgment. And so, right or wrong, we do it as human beings, and a lot of that plays into our confirmation biases, how we size someone up, what we think in that instant. And so I think just being self-aware of that happens can help us to recognize my instant judgment may or may not be right. But when we're working on our own presence, recognizing most people may not be that self-aware to consciously think, hey, because I feel connected to this person, I may or may not be, or because I don't feel connected to this person, that may or may not be true. Let me explore that a little bit more. So when we're thinking about our presence, we really do have to pay attention to that, that initial impression. So to go back to your question, Ariel, as why is this important? Well, that right there tells us why it is important, because it is that initial, when we think about rapport building, and we think about how a person feels when they're with us. And there's a big difference between being cocky and being confident. And that sense, because when we are confident, people feel safe in our space. They feel that sense of rapport and connection with us. And I know as coaches, that's one of the things, when we first start working with people, if we've got to climb a mountain to get them, to a place of comfort and safety, we may be halfway through an engagement. So, it's very important that we build that rapport. And I think for anyone wanting to aspire, in whether it's the professional world or in your personal life, really working on and being aware of how am I showing up, and almost thinking about our brand. What is my brand? And I know I myself do this, and I work with a lot of leaders to what I call just meditational moments. So before you go into a meeting with a group of people or one person, just pause and a couple of deep breaths. And how do I want to show up in this space? And it is amazing what that will do to center us and then bring us back into the executive function of the brain of how do I want to show up.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's so important, because think of the times that we have showed up and we're not our best self, and we've had a rough day or whatever the case might be. And no matter how many other times you've showed up and you've been your best self, it can take that one time where you're having a really bad day. And not that we can't have bad days, but just, again, I think when we talk about presence, that it's being consistent. And so I know when I come in the office on this day, I know that my behavior is going to be consistent and what people expect my behavior to be. And again, balancing that with, of course, we're going to have tough days and we need to be authentic, but also across the board, we try to be consistent and having that shift and that refocus.
Yeah, definitely. And you guys both brought up some good points that I wasn't going to ask about till later, but I'm going to ask them now about executive presence and brand. You used the word brand, and also you used being authentic. And so I want to kind of dive into executive presence and how that represents your personal brand, but also the brand of your organization, but also being authentic. Like, how do you kind of balance all of those and maintain?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that is really important is, one, knowing when we talk about being authentic, is being aware of what our values are, and what our belief systems are, and then how we want to show up, knowing that. And I like to think of our values as the anchor. So if you think of the metaphor of a buoy, and our values are what anchor us, and then the top part of the buoy can be our behaviors, and we can flex those behaviors. So if we're talking with someone that maybe is more extroverted, more excitable, and we're more introverted, we can flex. We can be a little more animated to help them feel more comfortable, because of those mirroring neurons. We know that that's what makes people feel connected. Or if we are more extroverted, and we really enjoy, excitable conversations, we can flex that behavior when we're working with someone or meeting with someone. So immediately I think it's that emotional intelligence of sizing up the social situation that's going on, and then matching and mirroring the neurons. And that doesn't mean that we can't slowly, I use the metaphor of like boiling the frog in the water, that we can't slowly raise the temperature either direction. But if we come in doing that, we typically will hurt our rapport or our brand, especially if it's people who don't know us very well, or we're new in a situation where we're really working to build that. But I want to grab a hold of that word consistency, because if we were to just take some words, that executive presence, it is about our consistency. It is about us living into being authentic and true, and that it's okay to disagree, but how do we do it? How are we, as we talked about, showing up out here? on the outside, which is that brand. And if we don't think about it, our brand then lives us rather than us living our brand.
Right.
That's good. There's a quote that I used in one of my presentations on presence, and I can't quote it verbatim, but essentially it's this idea that we all have a brand, or we're all a walking billboard, whether we know it or whether it's working for us or not. And I think that's important to remember. Again, this just goes beyond the C-suite level, but wherever you are in your career and your career trajectory, is that you are a brand in and of yourself, and it might be working for you, or you may have no idea what your brand is. And as Michelle said, a lot of that is being self-aware and focusing on, what are my values, what are the things that are important to me, how do I want to show up, how do I want people to view me, and in looking in your workplace environment, and we were talking about this earlier, if there's a time where you feel that you're being inauthentic, or you're having to rise to that next level and to have executive presence, it may feel inauthentic to you, then maybe it's time to reevaluate where you're working, or the environment that you're working in, if it's not congruent with your own personal belief system. So I want to be honest about that, but also knowing that if we want to rise in the corporate world or in whatever career, sometimes there are norms that we have to adhere to. And once it goes beyond our comfortability, or once it goes beyond our moral judgment, or whatever the case may be, then maybe it's time to reevaluate where you are in your particular career.
Which is why it's so important to know your values.
Right.
And if something is crossing your values, sometimes something may cross our values, and it's not necessarily wrong. Like, we have a tendency, if something is different from our values, to think it's wrong. So for example, if I have a value of my own work-life balance, and my time and time with my family, let's say that's a core value, and I go to work for a firm that it just so happens that the culture there is that everybody does 12-hour days, they take clients out at night. There's nothing wrong that's how that firm has built their culture. However, if that's out of alignment for me, then I would have to compromise my values in order to be successful there. And then I'm being incongruent and inauthentic with myself. And it's hard to show up in strong presence when we're being incongruent with our own values.
Right. And so kind of going off of that, I just kind of was thinking of, we try to define executive presence, but then it really also sounds like we still need to think about our own values and our own self. And so can executive presence look different for everyone, or do you think that there's like this standard to executive presence?
That's a good question.
I did not prepare them for that.
No, that's an excellent question. I mean, initially, my thought is, someone can be in blue jeans and a t-shirt and tennis shoes. And if that's the appropriate thing in the appropriate place, just like, so for example, if I go in and I'm working with an organization where it's mostly construction workers there, even if they're all leaders, I'm not going to show up in a black suit. I'm going to show up with what makes them feel comfortable.
Right.
But then likewise, I may go someplace else, and if I showed up that way, then they wouldn't feel comfortable. So remember, part of this is that the audience feels comfortable with us as well. And again, that's not changing who you are.
Right.
It's matching and mirroring.
I think a good example of this, I used to work with political leaders, is when you see politicians, when they're typically, if they're at a debate, suit and tie, or for the females it's a suit or a nice dress, but when they go to work catastrophe relief, they're not showing up in a suit. Why? Because that would seem they wouldn't be able to connect as much with people who have been through some sort of catastrophic event. So you see them in a more dressed down type of attire. And so I think both yes and. I think you could, there are standards, and that there are qualities that you see across the board when we talk about executive presence. But then, as Michelle said, knowing your audience and making sure that's part of presence, is making sure that your audience and the people that you're connecting with and working with feel comfortable around you.
Definitely. So going back, those are the core. I think the outward appearance of how we dress and look and show up that is important because that is what people see instantly, but there's also what they feel.
Right.
And that is not to get too woo-woo, but that is where we're intentional about that aura and that presence, and why it's so important if we've had a haggard day, and sometimes days like that happen, that we just take a couple of moments before we go in to even meet with our team members. You know, how am I wanting to show up? Just a couple of deep breaths, and you know, all right. You know, I always jokingly say, you know, showtime. You know, the curtain's about to open. There is a showtime. And then there's times where before that curtain opens, that I don't know if any of you've ever done drama where, oh my gosh, there's 10,000 things going on, but once that curtain opens, everything's okay. And that's not being inauthentic.
Right.
Because also with our, you know, if we're with, so jokingly, I'll be all transparent. You know, I shared when I first came in here with our team because I know them, I'm comfortable with them. I was like, you guys, I'm just really grumpy today. You know, but I did my few deep breaths and getting in the moment. Now, with an audience that I had never been with before, I wouldn't have walked in front of them and said that because there's not rapport there yet. Right. And so that would have caused confusion of, oh boy, where is she going with this? And so recognizing where and when we are more transparent is also a part of managing your presence.
Right. Yeah. And that makes me think of, like, first of all, thank you for sharing such a real example, because I think everyone can definitely relate to having those moments. I know when thinking about executive presence, one of the things that I've seen a lot is how you handle stress and how you deal with, like, difficult situations. That kind of just makes me think of that, of, you know, you have so much going on in your mind and stuff, but then when you're out in front of your team, like, you need to let that subside and then really carry yourself. So, you know, I wouldn't have, if Michelle didn't say she was grumpy, I wouldn't have known because of your presence when you walked in. Like, I was just like, oh, I was surprised about that. But do you guys have any thoughts on, you know, how to handle that stress or, you know, maintaining that composure?
It's challenging sometimes. I will say, someone once told me that, gave me this analogy, and it has always stuck with me, that it's almost like a duck on the water, whereas on the surface the duck is just floating, but if you look beneath the surface, their feet are going 90 miles a minute to keep them above the water. And so I think similarly as leaders is that on the surface we are composed, and that's what we want out of our leaders, especially in times of crisis or when things are stressful. We look to our leadership, and if our leadership feels out of control or stressed out, then that can feel very stressful for us, because then we feel insecure and uncertainty. So I always think about that analogy about the duck, of that there may be a lot going on underneath the surface, but when it's time for me to show up, whether it's at a public event, whether it's with my team, my colleagues, that we take that deep breath, and that they're not aware of all the things that might be going on, or they may be aware, but they also know that you're consistent and that you're not going to fly off the handle. And I think that's one thing that we see throughout when we talk about presence, is that and in leadership, is that you're consistent. And when things are really tough sometimes and stressful, that there's not this sense of unpredictability of how is Michelle going to show up today? I don't know. But no, I know she's going to show up, and things might be stressful, but she's consistent.
Yeah, and it's not Pollyanna-ish at all. It's saying, yeah, this is tough, you guys. I'm feeling the stress of it too, and we're going to make it through this. And do we need to regroup? And do we need to back up and repunt? And, you know, so as a leader, it is that we're not lighting our hair on fire in front of our, you know, our teams, metaphorically, as part of our presence, and being able to share concerns, but also being able to help to manage, you know, to be the thermostat, so to speak, you know, to be able to manage that temperature is a really important thing. But it's, you know, I think this goes to such a bigger conversation of emotional intelligence. You know, and Ariel, we've talked about this a lot, how it's like, man, no matter what we talk about, it all seems to go back to emotional intelligence. Because if I find myself, so I'm going to be vulnerable and transparent here, part of, like, why am I feeling grumpy today? Part of it is because I've been traveling so much this month. Now, every place I've gone has been wonderful work, meaningful clients. I've loved it. There's been too much of a good thing. Now, who can manage that? Only I can manage that. To say, how do I want to manage that in the future so that I don't have something like this happen again? Because when we're spent, when we've stretched ourselves too far, we can't show up well for anyone. And so, but we first have to be self-aware of that, and then choose to that next phase of then be self-managed of what will I do differently then. And I think about the circles of influence of what can I control, what can I influence, and what do I accept. And then living into our presence within those different spheres and being aware of, am I going bananas over something that I need to accept? So for example, I don't have control over that part of the budget. Well, I could scream and flail around and be all angry about that, or I could accept it, or I could go back to, well, can I influence this? Or I could go back to control, and control could be, no matter how hard I've tried, I don't get to make the change here. Is this the right place for me, as you were talking about earlier? Or do I need to make a change? So always going back to where can I get back into control, because that's where we have to first feel in control of ourselves before we can ever feel in control of anything else. And I'm not talking about controlling anybody, because we sure can't ever control anybody. But that's so tied in. I feel like we've gone a lot of different directions, but all these tentacles are so tied in to presence. And being aware of that is important.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up emotional intelligence, because it always does come back to that. Because I feel like really with anything, the different topics that we've discussed each month, it's always like, well, how can I have more confidence, or how can I, be better at time management? Like, it always comes back to being self-aware. And executive presence is no difference. Like, you really need to be aware of yourself and your values, but then also understand how that impacts others. And you guys gave some great examples of how how your presence can impact your team, whether they're going to be like, all right, like, I know we can get through this, or she's running around with a chicken with her head cut off, and like, I don't know what's going to happen. So do you guys have any personal examples of a time where a leader just really exuded executive presence and like really carried their team, or where you were like, this leader is just really lacking that, and how it impacted the team? What are some of your stories?
I've seen both.
Yeah.
I've seen great examples of leaders who maintained composure under very stressful times, and then therefore that made us feel better as a team, and in times of uncertainty. And then I've also worked under leaders where they weren't always consistent, and that was very stressful. And walking into an office in the morning and not sure, what type of boss was going to show up that day. Was this the boss that was having a good day, or was this the boss that was having a really bad day? And that made it very stressful at times. So again, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse with the consistency piece, but I think that is what in my personal experience, when I've seen people who have really good presence, there's a consistency that's about them, and a composure about them.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And I mean, really, just to add to that, similar experiences. And executive presence or presence doesn't mean we're perfect. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. I think the more real we can be, the more connected people can feel with us, but the more steady that we can be in that realness. And so it's one, being aware of ourselves and then how we're showing up to others, but then that's reading other people, that social awareness to enhance the relationships. But immediately as you were asking that, Ariel, I thought of two different leaders. And one was I learned a lot from both of these leaders, a lot. One, though, when I think back, I think of this leader as just such an example to me of what I would always want to be as a leader. This person was not afraid to call the hard stuff, but they also were very, very encouraging, and they were very steady. Every once in a while there'd be a little this or a little that, but really, really steady. Then I think of another leader that I had that was probably more intelligent as far as IQ intelligence than this leader. And personality-wise, I really liked this person too. However, highs, low, lows. And I used to say jokingly, you don't know if you're going to walk in the office and get a metaphoric kiss on the cheek or punch in the nose, because I would use the word volatile is what it felt like. And now, it may probably, when I look back on this, because this was several years ago, so when I look back on this in retrospect, it was probably more like this, boop, boop, but to me, it felt like it was like this,
right?
Because I was experiencing it. So it was probably, maybe it was only once a month that there was, the craziness, but when you're living it and experiencing it, because it feels so inconsistent,
right.
and you don't know when it's going to happen. It's like if you walked outside and somebody dropped a water balloon on your head, that would be very annoying. Because you weren't expecting it. Versus if you're in a water balloon fight, you expect to get hit in the head with a water balloon. But that's what it feels like when a leader's inconsistent, or you walk into something that you weren't expecting.
Right. Because it just makes me think of then you have probably this paranoid feeling of, even though it doesn't happen all the time, but the fact that it happens, you never know when it's going to be the time.
Yeah. So. I can remember with this leader, and it was really years ago, and it was when we first started. It wasn't a brick phone, but it was pretty close to a brick. But I remember, I would see this leader's name pop up, and instead of answering the phone, I was like, oh, just let him leave a message. And then, then I'll check it after I get the message, once I'm prepared and I can think about how I want to respond, because I didn't know what I was going to get. Right. Whereas with the other leader, it would have been like, oh yeah, anytime they called, I would have been happy to have the conversation.
Yeah. Definitely. And we talked about a little bit about how executive presence is just, we're talking about presence in general. So, why is it important for anyone to think about their presence, rather than, someone who's not at the executive level yet, can they still carry that executive presence?
Absolutely. Yes. 100% yes.
Yeah.
It does not matter at what level what position that you're in, or what level you're working in. That your presence is essentially, it's what we've been talking. It's how you show up. So whether that's in the workplace, whether that's at the grocery store, wherever, the coffee shop, wherever it might be, it's essentially how I'm showing up and how I'm making other people feel. And so across all interactions socially, and I go back to that quote of, we all have a brand, and we all are taking snap judgments of people as we meet them. And so how we show up is such a big part of this. So wherever you are in your career, you have this opportunity to cultivate presence. And it kind of goes back to, well, is leadership within, or can it be cultivated? Of course, same with executive presence. There are some people that this comes more naturally for than others. But that doesn't mean that these skills that we've been talking about can't be cultivated. First and foremost, starting with being self-aware and knowing what your strengths are. And one of the things I wrote down in my notes is being very clear about what your strengths are and leveraging those. And so if you're not necessarily the most extroverted person, being aware of that and saying, okay, well, the next time I'm in a meeting, I'm going to make a conscious effort to speak up more than I normally would. Or conversely, I'm an extreme extrovert and I tend to dominate the conversation. So the next time I'm in a meeting, I'm going to hold back and give other people an opportunity to speak. So again, maybe we're talking about emotional intelligence, but it comes back to being very self-aware. And that is a lesson that we can all learn from, and we can all start at a very young age.
Yeah. And I do agree. It's like emotional intelligence. It's like conversational intelligence. These things are learnable. And, like anything, for some people it is easier than others. For some people it's easier to learn how to play a guitar. But we could all learn it if we chose to embrace the discipline of doing that. And, Ariel, to go to that original question of, should we wait? Is living into our present something that we do once we get that next promotion? It's something that you do for yourself. It's really not something that you're doing for others. Now, others get the benefit of it, but beginning with whatever your age is, how do I want to show up in the world? How do I want to be perceived? And is my intention of that impacting others? the way that I want it to? And if not, where do I make adjustments? Not where do other people make adjustments in that? So, one of the things that, I've always said, live your legacy now. Don't wait to live your legacy after you die, because then it's over. You've already lived it. Then people just declare what it is at that point. But the minute we start being aware of this, because several years ago I wrote a blog called "Someone's Always Watching," and it was off of a young man that I was observing in a yogurt shop. And and I had a conversation with him afterwards. Little did he know, but just watching and observing him. And his behavior. So we never know when someone is watching. So living into that brand, that old saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Unfortunately, that's not true. No. We don't live in a house of cards. Or if we do, are we? And we talk about, even in our authentic leadership classes, we talk about, if I went to any of the rooms of your house, metaphorically, would I recognize you consistently as the same person?
Yeah. And let's kind of feeding off of that. We've talked a lot about kind of like your in-person presence. What about online? Because we're in a digital age now, and we have profiles on different social media and just like emails. And so I just would like to hear some of your like perspectives on executive presence online, or any tips that you might have. What does that look like for you all?
Extremely important. I'm glad you raised that topic, because again, it goes back to that consistency. So if my online persona is discrepant from what you see in the office, again, there's this tension. Well, I thought that they were this person, and not that, our private social media, we share, different pictures of our families and things like that. But again, there should be a consistency, whether that's online or in person. And if there's a discrepancy in those, then I would say it would be time to take a look and say why. And as you said with that analogy, if you go and look in all these rooms in my house, would I recognize you across all of these rooms? And if not, if in this one room I wouldn't recognize you, then maybe that we need to explore that and figure out why. Why is this discrepant from all these other things? Right. And online communication, especially, because so much can be misconstrued through a message, through an email communication or a text message. And so I think it's even more critical in how we present ourselves online, because you don't have those nonverbals. You have the screen, so whereas I'm sitting across from both of you, I can read your nonverbals. I can see when Michelle's smiling, Ariel's smiling, whereas when we're in front of a screen, we don't have that. So I think you have to be even more cautious.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and there may be things that, and I'm not saying being inconsistent with who you are in your value system, but, maybe you're playing some silly games with your family or with friends or something, and maybe you don't post that, because that's not something that you just want to share across all of social media as part of your brand. May not be anything wrong with it at all. We're not saying that. It's just that picking and choosing what you share and what you say. And it's just like, don't shop and drink wine. You probably don't want to post on social media and drink wine. You may regret it later. So when you think about your brand or drink whatever. So just, keeping that consistency there. Yeah.
Great. And so as we're kind of wrapping up our conversation, what would you all recommend, or what advice would you give to someone who is looking to improve their executive presence?
Well, since I got looked at, those nonverbal cues, my social awareness just hit there. Well, one of the first things I would say is ask for, do a self-evaluation of really looking at, how do I want to show up? If you haven't created your brand or gone through some sort of a branding process, to do that, to identify what your values are, how you want to show up on a regular basis, and then to start doing some self-evaluation of, am I showing up this way? And you heard me use the words intention and impact, and so when I create my brand and I, identify my values within myself, that's my intention. Is that how I'm impacting those around me? And one of the best ways I can do that is, one, to self-evaluate, but also to ask others and to ask for that feedback from other people. And we don't want to be a mini me of someone else, but to watch other people and to pick up on things that other people do and to say, what do I like about that? What is it about that person that when I'm in their presence, I feel very comfortable, I feel very peaceful, I feel confident. What are they exuding? What are they doing? And what might I want to work to emulate while still being true and authentic to myself? I think there's also some really good books out there that you can read to help enhance. And they're going to collect information, but then distill it down to what works for you. Everything that you get your hands on isn't going to work for you. I often say when I read a book, if 50% of it I feel is applicable, wow, that was great. Sometimes it may only be 10 or 15%, but I grab a hold of that 10 or 15%. So I know that April's got a couple of books she's going to recommend as well. This is one book that I recommend. It's called Own the Room. It's written by 2 executive coaches, and when I first picked up the book, I didn't realize that it was written by 2 executive coaches. What I like about this book, so one, I think many of us, like we attempted to even do here today, is defining what executive presence is. I think how to get there is somewhat of a challenge. So if you are looking for something that gives you some activities, some step-by-step processes, some little assessments that you can do, that you can take and then retake to have some measurables, then this is the book for you. This book is also a lot about finding your voice in your executive presence and what they, basically finding your own executive voice and knowing how to flex that style, knowing when to speak up for yourself, knowing when to speak up for others, and basically how you're showing up in the room with that. So lots of great resources out there, but we didn't want to overwhelm you guys with those, and some really good TED Talks.
Yes.
And things that you can hone in on. But that is my recommendation.
Great. And I second everything Michelle said in terms of taking self-evaluation and being very honest with yourself, which is tough. It's hard to be honest with ourselves and to take that hard look. And so if you are struggling with that, then ask a trusted friend or colleague to help you with that, of setting that intention and then asking, is this is how I want to show up? Am I showing up like this? Or this is how I feel like I'm showing up, but then asking someone, am I really showing up?
And then just
like
say thank you when they give you
yes.
feedback.
Don't become defensive, which is easy to do, but don't become defensive. Just say thank you for your feedback and then begin to work on it. And the two books I have, and I've also read Own the Room, and I recommend that. This one is called Power Cues, and he outlines a lot of nonverbal stuff, communication, as well as just your presence in general and how you can work on your different nonverbal and verbal communication. So I recommend this one, as well as executive presence, where this one she talks a lot about, she defines what executive presence is, and then she does give, probably not in as much detail as Own the Room, tangible steps, but these are good places to start if you're interested in the topic.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing all your knowledge about executive presence and presence in general. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the book recommendations. And thank you everyone that watched us live, or if you watch the replay, please leave some comments below of your definition of executive presence or any questions that you might have. And if you need a coach, that's what we're here for. Is we can help you build on your executive presence. So you can check out our website, MSBCoach.com, or shoot us an email, info@MSBCoach.com. And thanks again for joining us, and we will be back next year with more Facebook Lives.
Next year.
Wait, so hold up before you end, because I do want to, this is like the outtakes. Yeah. So April, will you share? So April just did was it a TEDx or talk, and so one, the topic I thought was phenomenal. Topic is not about executive presence, but you can watch it and you can see how, just an example of exuding executive presence, and that's something where in a moment you've got to grab your audience in. You've got a very short amount of time, and do they tune in or do they tune out? So I wanted to see if you wanted to share that, where they can find that, or what would they Google to get to that.
We can put it in the links in the comments too.
Okay. Yeah, so I did what Michelle's referring to. I did a TEDx Youth RVA talk about a month ago on sustainable fashion, but as we were talking about executive presence, I had roughly 5 minutes to deliver a message that was very near and dear to my heart and to capture an audience. So feel free to check that out. You can Google TEDx RVA Youth and then put my name in, and the talk should come up. So thank you.
And as Ariel said, we'll put it in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope, however you celebrate your holidays, that you have wonderful holidays. And thank you for taking the time out to join us here today. So bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.